It is a new year in Heatherfield Farm. Now, are you ready for the first story? Right. It's called Springtime. Winter at Heatherfield Farm had been very cold. Snow had fallen a number of times, and the large pond was frozen over. It seemed all the days were dull and grey, and that the sun had gone away. It had been very difficult for all the animals and birds. The ground was often too hard for blackbirds, thrushes, and our little friend Roberta Robin to dig for worms, and there were no seeds, grubs, or insects for blue tits, great tits, chaffinches, dunnocks, or sparrows to eat. Fortunately, the Sutcliffes decided to help by filling up a nut holder each day, hanging up special fat balls, and leaving any of their unwanted food either on the lawn or on the compost heaps. They also made sure there was plenty of clean water available and that it wasn't frozen, because birds and animals can get very thirsty. Cyril the squirrel was also lucky because Mr. Niffypong had shown him where there were lots of nuts that Jacob the gardener had thrown onto one of the compost heaps. Well, even if the animals and birds in the garden were not starving, it was still pretty miserable to be cold all the time and to have short days and long nights. So when one morning in the middle of January Seraphine was taking a little walk near the old oak tree, she almost jumped for joy. Just poking through a thin coating of snow and sparkling frost, there was a little white flower. It was a snowdrop. "Oh, how beautiful and brave you are, little snowdrop," she said to it, as she knelt down to take a closer look. Gently brushing away the snow, she was thrilled to find there were other snowdrops. She would dearly like to have picked them, but she knew that the flowers would soon die if she did. So she left them there, deciding instead to rush home and tell everyone the good news. "It won't be long before spring is here," Mr. Tittlewit cheerfully declared. Sure enough, over the next few weeks, the garden began little by little to wake up. After the snowdrops, there came splashes of colour as yellow, orange, and light mauve crocus flowers suddenly pushed through the soil. The buds on the trees fattened and looked as if they would burst at any minute with blossom and tender green leaves. In trees and bushes, the silence of winter was now replaced by the chatter, twitter, and song of birds ready to build nests and start new families. It was as if the earth and the air were now filled with energy, anxious to be busy. In a corner of the greenhouse there was also the hint of something beginning to stir. Comfortable in an open cardboard box, Mr. Prickle the Hedgehog gave a little grunt and a big yawn as he stretched first his front legs and then his hind legs. Sleepily he began to scratch his soft tummy. It is true he had woken up a few times during his winter hibernation to have a drink and a little snack, but he still couldn't remember why he was in the greenhouse. As you and I already know, he had first tried to hibernate under a big pile of leaves, not realizing that it was going to be a bonfire. Tittlewits and Niffypongs had raised the alarm when they had seen smoke coming from the burning leaves. Then it was Tolstoy who came to the rescue, barking loudly and showing Jacob where to look. Kind old Jacob had made sure the still sleeping Mr. Prickle would be safe and sound, less snugly in a corner of the greenhouse. Anyway, all the confusion of how he got there was soon forgotten when Mr. Prickle's tummy started to rumble. "Ah, my oh my," he muttered to himself. "I'm really feeling rather peckish. It's time for a bit of breakfast, I think." And with that, and another big yawn, Mr. Prickle started to waddle out of the greenhouse in search of a big, juicy slug. The greenhouse did not remain empty of a resident for very long. Content to roost in bushes, trees, and under the eaves of the old farmhouse during winter, Roberta Robin was now intent on finding a safe and comfortable place to build a nest for the new family she was going to have with her faithful husband, Robbo Robin. It was very important to have a neat little nest so that she could lay her eggs and know they would be safe and wouldn't roll about and break. When she saw Mr. Prickle leave the greenhouse, she had an idea and went to investigate. "Gosh," she twittered, "this would be nice and warm and we would be protected from the rain." So Roberta flew off to tell Robbo, and it wasn't long before both of them were flying in and out of the greenhouse with moss, twigs, dried leaves, old feathers, bits of fluff, grass, and anything else that helped to make a strong and cosy nest. Now, as you can imagine, spring is a busy time for gardeners. Jacob had already started to tidy up the garden. He had cut the grass for the first time and dug over the flower borders and vegetable plot, ready for sowing and planting. As he kept a lot of his tools in the garage, he hadn't been in the greenhouse for some days. When he did, he had a surprise when Roberta suddenly flew past him, almost brushing his shoulder. She had been sitting on her new nest and had not expected Jacob to come in. Jacob chuckled and then began to look round the greenhouse, wondering what Roberta had been doing. It was then that Jacob had his next surprise, because he found Roberta's nest. "Well, you cheeky little robin, where do you think I'm going to make my tea now?" On a bench at the back of the greenhouse there was a little stove, and on top of the stove was Jacob's old aluminium kettle. He had hoped the kettle would be empty, but it was not, because Roberta had decided it was just the sort of place a clever robin should make her nest. Gently lifting the round kettle off the stove and placing it to one side, Jacob peered in. "Well, I never!" he exclaimed with a little laugh, because inside the kettle and its nest were already 2 beautiful little blue and speckled eggs. Jacob thought for a while. He was now a bit worried. He knew that if he kept going in and out of the greenhouse, Roberta would probably get frightened and abandon her nest and its eggs. "Dear me," Jacob pondered. "How am I going to solve this one? I can't move the nest, but I do need my greenhouse. Otherwise, where am I going to put my seed trays and young plants?" Then Jacob had an idea. Leaving the greenhouse, but making sure its door remained open, he went round to the side of the house where he had left his old bike. He had decided to ride into the village and buy something special from the pet shop. After half an hour, Jacob returned to Heatherfield Farm. He got off his bike, leaned it against the garage wall, and then opened the large wooden box that was attached to the bike just behind the saddle. He took out a flat metal can. "Now, let's see if this'll do the trick," he muttered to himself. Creeping silently, Jacob approached the greenhouse. There was a garden bench close by, so he sat on it and then opened the can from the pet shop. You would be very surprised to see what was inside it. It was crammed full of tiny wriggling mealworms. There were hundreds of them, maybe even 1,000 of them, that had hatched out from beetle eggs. Fishermen liked to use them as bait, putting them on the end of their fishing lines to attract fish. But birds love them too. Indeed, robins just cannot resist them and will take all kinds of risks to get them. Jacob wasn't sure if Roberta had come back to her nest in the kettle. He just hoped that her little fright had been a temporary one. Anyway, Jacob took the open can and placed it an arm's length away on the edge of the bench. Then he sat patiently, quiet and very still. Very soon he sensed a gentle fluttering and looked up. On the roof of the greenhouse, just above the doorway, there was a robin. He wasn't sure whether it was Roberta or her mate Robbo. He guessed it might be Robbo because he had a very red breast and looked very bold. Indeed, it was Robbo. The small bird was sizing up the situation. First it looked at the mealworms and then at Jacob. Robbo kept doing this for a while, And then he made his decision. Swooping down, almost faster than your eye could follow him, he landed on the can, snatched a mealworm, and immediately zoomed into the greenhouse. Within moments, Robbo was back again, this time flying straight onto the can, hardly touching it, before he was off once more into the greenhouse with yet another mealworm. "Ah, I know what he's doing," Jacob murmured triumphantly. "He's taking his little wife her lunch." Jacob was right. When lady robins lay their eggs, they have to keep them warm. It is called incubation. If they don't do this, the eggs never produce little chicks. And because it's only the lady robins and not their husbands who do the incubating, it is very important for husbands like Robbo to go and get food for their wives. What Robbo didn't realize was that every time he came back to the can, Jacob had moved it a bit closer to himself. Then, after about 6 visits, Robbo had a surprise. The can wasn't there anymore. Instead, Jacob was holding out his hand, and in his palm there were lots of wiggly mealworms. Robbo wasn't sure what to do, so he stood on the edge of the bench, twittering what sounded like an alarm call. Jacob stayed ever so still, with his arms stretched out. Suddenly, Robbo made a dash at Jacob's hand, snatched a mealworm, and was off again. It didn't take long before Robbo built up enough courage to trust Jacob. He soon realized the old gardener meant him no harm, and very soon he was confident enough to sit on one of Jacob's fingers and eat some mealworms himself. He was very hungry after all that flying about. At the end of half an hour, Jacob decided to move. Very slowly and quietly, he crept to the doorway of the greenhouse, still holding out his hand with mealworms in it. Robbo continued to take them, and it wasn't long before Roberta saw what was happening. In the end, and overcoming her uncertainty, she too began to copy Robbo and started to take mealworms from Jacob's open hand. Very soon Jacob could go back into his greenhouse and do his gardening work with flower pots and seed trays without the robins worrying about him. He simply left the open can of mealworms on a shelf for Roberta and Robbo to pick at whenever they were hungry. He didn't leave it there all the time because he didn't think it would be a good idea if the robins started to get too fat and lazy. Sometimes he closed the can, and that meant Robbo and Roberta had to go out and find their own food. It was also a good idea because it ensured the robins had a more varied and healthy diet that included bugs, flies, worms, caterpillars, and grubs. When they were absent from the nest, Jacob would go and see what was in it. He was delighted to find a new egg each day until there were 5. Unlike other birds that lay their eggs first thing in the morning, lady robins leave it until later. First they like to make sure they've had a good breakfast of worms and insects. Then, around the middle of the morning, they lay 1 egg. They do this each day until there is a clutch of about 4 to 6 of them. Sometimes there are more depending on how much food they've been able to find. Jacob tried not to spend too much time in the greenhouse, and he certainly kept well away from Roberta and her nest. He did not want to disturb her. Jacob thought Roberta was a very good mother because she stayed on her eggs almost all the time, never leaving them for more than 5 or 10 minutes. After 12 days of her incubating the eggs, Jacob was in the greenhouse when he thought he heard a new little twittering noise. He dearly wanted to see what it was, but had to wait until Roberta left the nest for some exercise and feeding. When Roberta flew off, Jacob took his chance and went over to look inside the kettle. There he saw a tiny chick. It was entirely naked without a single feather, and its eyes were still closed. It would be another 5 days before those eyes would start to open, and 10 before it had most of its feathers. Very soon all the chicks hatched, and whenever Mummy Roberta and Daddy Robbo came with some food, the little chicks opened their beaks very wide and made lots of noise to make sure they got their proper share. Strangely, though, when Roberta and Robbo were not there, the chicks stayed very, very quiet. You would not have known they were there at all. They did this so as not to attract predators like cats, hawks, weasels, or stoats that might want to come and eat them. Jacob also worried about the safety of the chicks, so he decided to close the greenhouse door to prevent any dangerous predator getting in. Roberta and Robbo got very confused when they found the door closed. They had been flying so fast they almost crashed into it. Fortunately, the greenhouse had a window in its roof, and Jacob had left this wide open. Roberta and Robbo soon found it and were quite happy to fly in and out of it. Roberta knew all about safety. After all the chicks had hatched and were able to cuddle up and keep each other warm, she only visited them to feed them and tidy up the nest. Again, the reason was she didn't want to attract predators. Roberta made sure the nest was very clean, taking any rubbish away, including the little poos her chicks did. These poos were never messy or smelly, because the chicks did them in little parcels called fecal sacks, which were easy for Roberta to pick up and carry away. Jacob was very impressed how hard Roberta and Robbo worked to feed, protect, and bring up their tiny children, so he decided to help them out a little, opening the can of mealworms again so that they would not have so far to fly for food. It was probably because of this that each little chick grew very strong and contented, and it was not long before their flight feathers had grown and they were stretching their wings, building their muscles, and practicing how to fly. After about 3 weeks since they had hatched from their eggs, Jacob opened the greenhouse one morning to find that each of the chicks had left their nest in the kettle and were now fluttering about between shells and the greenhouse floor. "Oh, well, it looks like I've got to let you little ones out now, or I'll get into trouble with your parents," he chortled. He had grown very fond of the robin family. He had looked after them, helped to feed them, and now even felt like he was the grandpa to the 5 young robins. Of course, he worried for them because they were still learning to fly and had little idea of how dangerous their little world could be. When they found their way out of the greenhouse, it was Daddy Robbo who took charge. It seemed it was his job to keep control of his children, guiding them and helping if ever they got into difficulty or were in danger. This wasn't easy, because the little birds always seemed to be flying in different directions. Now, Robbo was a very good teacher, and soon all his children learnt from him what to do, how to feed themselves, and how to keep safe. They had become very good flyers, but it would be some while before they had the brown and grey plumage of their parents, together with the pretty red breast. Instead, they were now a speckled brown. This was very good for youngsters, because it was like camouflage, making them almost invisible in the trees and on the ground. The robin family stayed together for some weeks, but after that the youngsters flew off to find their own territories in other gardens and fields. Roberta knew this was best for them, but still felt very much like a mummy. Indeed, if she sometimes saw a chick from another family, like a blackbird, a thrush, or a willow warbler, she would often make sure it had a nice worm to eat. Roberta was truly a very sweet robin. Jacob also missed the young robins, but was happy that he'd been able to give them a good start in life. Anyway, he was never truly alone, especially when he dug the soil or raked it or hoed it, because he knew that Roberta and Robbo would always be next to him, just a metre or so away, waiting for him to dig up a bug or a worm. Then they would fly off to sit on a fence, a wall, or a branch, there to twitter and sing for Jacob.